For the provisional cast on of the short story sweater, we're going to need our main color of yarn, a length of waist yarn. I'm going to use my contrasting color for that. Your working needle, you probably have a circular needle, but I'm going to make a tiny little version of the sweater, so I'm going to work with DPNs. So I'm just going to need one of them for the cast on, and I also need a crochet hook of like roughly the same size as the main needle. To start with, I'm going to use my waist yarn or your contrasting color, and I'm going to make a slip knot and place that slip knot onto my crochet hook. Then I hold my crochet hook in my right hand needle, my working yarn in my left hand, and my needle in my left hand as well. And I'm going to hold it over the working yarn. So the working yarn is between my the crochet hook in my right hand and my left hand, and I'm going to place the needle on top of that working yarn thread. And I'm going to use the crochet hook to pull a loop over the needle and through the stitches on my crochet hook, and I'm going to tug on the end a little to secure it. So the working yarn is now on top of the needle, and I'm going to use my left hand to bring it under the needle to the other side again. And then I'm going to just repeat that motion of pulling a loop over the needle and through the stitch on my crochet hook. And that's how you provisionally cast on stitches, by crocheting them onto a needle. That's like my go-to and my favorite way to provisionally cast on stitches, because it's super easy to unravel. It just unzips very easily, that chain that we crocheted, without like catching onto a stitch. And we'll get to that part later, of course. The number of stitches you cast on provisionally is in your pattern. I'm going to cast on few stitches because I'm going to just make it like a mini version of the sweater for the tutorial. And I'm just going to zoom through this, and I'll see you at the end of my cast on. So when you've finished casting all your stitches and all your stitches are on your needles, I want you to crochet a couple more stitches without placing them on the needles. So just a couple of extra crocheted stitches right here at the end of the cast on, and that is going to mark the side of the provisional cast on where we start to unravel the provisional cast on later. So I'm going to just do a couple of stitches, so it doesn't really matter how many, just a few of them, and then I'm going to use my scissors to break the yarn, and I'm just going to pull out the last stitch, and that secures it. After provisionally casting on all my stitches, I'm going to knit all of them with my main color and then break the yarn. So I'm going to start my setup row 1 on the right side at this kind of longer tail of my provisional cast on that marks where we'll later start to unravel it. So after working all the stitches of the right side setup row 1, I have broken my main color, and I know it seems a bit counterintuitive, but we're going to reattach the color, the main color, in a different position on our wrong side row, and that's why we had to break the yarn here. So I'm going to turn around now and work my setup row on the wrong side, and here we're going to set up the folded hemline, so or the double knit hem. And for that we need to fold the beginning of the row and the end of the row. I'm going to actually use a DPN to transfer the first 6 stitches of the row onto that DPN. So I'm slipping them purlwise onto this DPN. And what I do then is I'm going to fold it or tilt this DPN so the tips of those needles are still together, and I'm going to tilt it so my DPN and my main needle are parallel to each other in my left hand, and the right sides are facing out. So this is the right side of the book, and this is the right side of the book, and the wrong sides are facing each other. And then I'm going to reattach my main color of yarn. And I'm going to start my row. So I just hold it here to the side a bit, because I'm going to start my row with slipping the first stitch of the back needle. So this is the back needle, this is the front needle, back and front. I'm going to first slip the first stitch of my back needle purlwise to my right hand needle, and then I'm going to reattach my main color with knitting the first stitch of the front needle. Then I slip the next stitch of the back needle purlwise with yarn in front, and knit the next stitch of the front needle. And I'm going to repeat that. Slip one of the back needle purlwise with the yarn in front, knit stitch on the front needle. I'm going to repeat that until I have 12 stitches here and no more stitches here on my DPN. So after knitting the last stitch, I can drop my DPN, and I'm also going to give that tail end here a bit of a tug to make sure that the stitch does not come unraveled. And then I'm going to place a stitch marker that marks the transition of this double knit hem that we have here and the main part of the body of the sweater. And then I'm going to purl to the last 12 stitches of the row, and then I'm going to repeat what I have done with this double knit hem on the other side of my sweater. So I have reached the last 12 stitches of my sweater and of the row, of the wrong side row, and I'm going to place another marker that marks again the transition of the main part of the body to this double knit hem. And for that I'm going to start with slipping all stitches, all remaining 12 stitches to my right hand needle. And now I need to do the same folding thing that I have done before. And for that, I'm going to slip the first or the last 6 stitches of the row onto a DPN. And the next 6 stitches onto my left hand needle. So kind of slip them back onto my left hand needle. Don't drop the stitch marker, and so I have half of my remaining stitches on one needle and half of them on the DPN, and I'm again going to fold. So I'm going to make sure these are a bit away from the tip. For that part I'm going to tilt this DPN again so that the wrong sides face each other. So now the wrong sides are facing me towards you as a knitter, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring these wrong sides to face each other. So that is by tilting my DPN in this direction. And what I need to do then is slide all my DPN through so that the tip is towards my right hand needle, and I can work those stitches. So bringing them back here onto the tip as well. I'm holding the DP and my left hand needle parallel to each other with the DP in front again. And I'm going to repeat what I had kind of done at the beginning of the row. I'm going to slip one stitch of the back needle purlwise with the yarn in front and knit the first stitch of the DP of the front needle. Slip one with the yarn in front of the back needle, knit one of the front needle. And I'm going to repeat this until all my remaining stitches have been worked. And just one more time, slip one purlwise with the yarn in front of the back needle, knit one of the front needle. And now I can drop my DP in again. And I have worked all my stitches. I've just pulled here a little on my tail end to make sure the stitch is not too long. And you can see the hem, the double knit hem at the beginning and the end, and my main body stitches here. And now I can continue working the row 1 of my section 1 here. What I want you to make sure or be aware of is that those hem stitches, you only work every other stitch of that hem. Just like we've done a setup row for the whole body, you're going to work only of every other stitch in one row. And that means that for the stitch gauge kind of to work out, it's best to try and work those stitches rather loosely compared to like your main body stitches. And the way I do it is I'm going to start this next section by again slipping the first stitch purlwise with yarn in front, and then I knit the next stitch. And the way I knit them loosely is by giving them a bit of a tug with my thumb towards the right side. So, and then I work the next stitch. And because it has a bit of more slack, because I kind of tug it here towards the right side, it's a little looser than what I do with my main body stitches. So those stitches will be a little looser, and because we only work them every other row, the stitch gauge kind of works out that it draws in the hem a little, but you don't want it to like draw in too much and get the hemline too tight. So that gives it enough slack, that little tilt or a little tug towards the right gives that a little more slack. Those stitches will be a little looser than the body stitches where I don't do that. Sorry. So for the body stitches, they're not getting tucked any which way, and these will be just knit a little tighter than the slightly looser knit hem stitches, and that will give those enough slack so they can stretch over those 2 rows, because they only worked every other row, and these are worked every row. Okay, I'm going to continue working my sweater, this side of the sweater, and I'm going to show you next how to close the sides of the sweater with a 3 needle bind off and a little Kitchener grafting for our double knit hem. So I finished my my shoulder decreases, my side decreases here in the middle before and after my stitch marker. And what I need to do is now is work those extra rows in front and the extra rows in back. And those are rows that reach from the hem to the underarm. So we're not going to work the sleeve stitches that are here in the center of our row, and we're just going to work on the first part of this row, And then later we're going to work the end of the row here, kind of from the underarm, so not the front part, not the sleeve stitches that will be placed on hold. So we're going to work from here to the end of the row. Those will like be at the underarm of your sweater and give you like better movement, just a little more slack at the underarm. So I'm going to work this setup row of my extra rows in front, and I'm going to place my sleeve stitches on hold here in this setup row. The number of stitches you have here is kind of dependent on the size you have. So it depends on your neckline options, it depends on the length of your sweater, and it also depends on your circumference. So there's a whole table that will tell you the right stitch count for your custom size option. And it's also going to tell you how many stitches you'll have left then for your side extra side rows. So I'm working my hem stitches here and slip the marker, and then I work up to the stitches that will be placed on hold for my sleeve. So the pattern is obviously going to tell you how many stitches you'll have for your sleeve, and I need to kind of eyeball it here a little for my mini version. So I'm going to just place work to, so let's say 8 stitches up to the marker, and then I'm going to place the next 8 stitches up to the marker and the 8 stitches after the marker on hold. And you can do that either by placing it on waste yarn or a second set of circular needles, or like a spare cable of your circular needles. So I'm going to place the same level of stitches before the marker and after the marker on hold. You can take out the marker while you do that, you can leave it in for later. I'm going to take it out, so I have 8 before the marker, and I drop the marker, and then another 8 here. So 8 is just a number that I'm just assuming for my tiny little version of the sweater, and this will be my sleeve stitches. So whatever the pattern tells you how many sleeve stitches you need to place on hold here for your chosen size is the one you want to place on hold here. So I'm just going to leave that on my waist yarn, and then I'm going to not work these remaining stitches of the row anymore. I'm just going to work the stitches here at the beginning of the row. So I'm going to slide them here onto the center of my cable, so they're on hold as well, but easily picked up again. And then I turn a work, and then I'm continuing working where like my working yarn is attached here, and I'm going to purl here until I reach the marker, and then I work the hem. Depending on kind of which size you're working, you'll work a different number of rows for those extra side rows. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to work 3 rows, but you'll probably for your human sized sweaters you need to work like the number of rows according to the pattern. So the one was in the setup, then I had the wrong side row, and I'm now just working this right side row until I'm like back at the underarm, and then I break my yarn and I slide those stitches from like the front extra rows in front, I slide them to the center of the needle on hold. And then I go back here and look for my stitches that are towards the end of the row that I had placed on hold on the center of the cable needle, cable of my circular needles, and I'm placing them back onto my left hand needles. And now I repeat here the same number of rows that I have worked in the front part. So those are the extra rows in the back. So my last of those extra rows ends here again on a right side. And I'm going to break the yarn. And then I'm going to slip the stitches that I just worked for my extra rows in back. I'm going to slip them back to the left hand needle. I do that because I want to start my side seam at the underarm. So I need to get to that place in the middle of my row. So this is where I want to start my side seam. So I'm going to work a 3 needle bind off, and that will bind off all my stitches at the same time, close the side seam of the sweater. And to do that, I'm going to first slide stitches of the front back onto the needle. And then I'm going to hold them together. So I'm going to hold both of my needles in my left hand, and I'm folding this in a way that the right side, so the knit sides of the sweater, is facing each other, and the wrong sides, or the purl sides of the sweater, is facing out. So I'm going to work a 3 needle bind off on the wrong side of my sweater. So I'm holding the both of my needle tips in my left hand parallel to each other, and I need a 3rd needle for my 3 needle bind off. And this is where you want to make sure it's the same size as your main needles as well. And to do this 3 needle bind off, I knit the first stitch of the front needle together with the first stitch of the back needle. And then I repeat this, knit these two together, and then I pass the first stitch over the second and off the needle. And I repeat this, knit them together, pass over, until I reach the marker. So as you see, this binds off the stitches and it connects the front and back pieces in one go, so you don't actually have to make a seam here. It's a very nice and neat and easy and fast way to close the side seam. So as I said, I'm repeating this until I reach the markers of my double knit hem. And then I have like this last stitch here remaining on my right hand needle from the 3 needle bind off. And now I'm going to actually break the yarn, and I'm going to leave a long tail, and I leave a long enough tail for working kitchen stitch along my double knit hem. So those stitches I can't connect with my 3 needle bind off because it will be visible otherwise. So I'm going to leave a long tail that I will use later to close this seam here with a kitchen stitch. And before that, I'm going to actually pull this tail end of the yarn through this last stitch on my right hand needle and pull to secure and tighten. So I can now remove my 3rd needle of the 3 needle bind off. I don't need that anymore. And I'm also going to remove both of my markers. And I only have my double knit hem stitches left. So what we need to do now is we need to connect the hem stitches from the front and the back in a way where we connect only this like front layer to the front layer of the back piece, and the back layer of this hem and back to the other layer. So what happens is we need to first kind of separate these two layers and divide stitches kind of differently onto our needles. They should be then like after we divide them, they should be kind of the same way on the needles as we had after casting them on initially. So we kind of have to bring them back to that initial kind of setup before we can do the actual kitchen stitch part. And for that we have to rearrange our stitches a bit. So what we do now is we start with dividing up our stitches, and we're going to start with dividing the stitches on the front needles. So we're going to first make sure that we don't drop any of those back needle stitches. So we're going to slide them on the center of the cable on hold. So to divide those stitches back into kind of single layer configuration. So now they're kind of double layered, but I want them to like all the front stitches next to each other and followed by all the back stitches. So we're going to want a single layer, and for that I'm going to divide them back up. And for that I need this second tip of my circular needles and a third needle. And I'm going to hold those two needles in my right hand with the DP in front and the circular needle, the right hand circular needle in the back. And I'm going to slip all the stitches from the left hand needle onto the right hand needles. And I'm going to start by slipping the first stitch here onto my back needle and the next onto the front needle. And I'm going to continue one to the back, one to the front until all my 12 stitches have been slipped. And then each layer of this double layer hem will be on a different needle. So you can see here that this layer is on this needle and the other layer is on the other needle. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to bring them back onto one needle. And for that I'm going to slip them all onto my DP. So I'm going to twist this a little and hold my what was the back needle here in my left hand, and I'm going to slip all those 6 stitches from the circular needle to my DP. So all the knit stitches are now facing the same direction. They're all in a single layer now, and these are ready for grafting. But first I also have to do the same for the other side of my hem, and for that I first slide my stitches, slide these hem stitches back to the DP, and I'm again using the second tip of my needles and the DP that holds my holds the other DP stitch that I have already in the right configuration, and I'm going to again hold the two needles in my right hand, but this time I'm holding the DP in back and the circular needle, the right hand circular needle in front. And I'm again going to slip one stitch onto the back needle and one onto the front needle until all my 12 stitches have been slipped. And then I again bring them back onto one needle, but in this case I'm bringing them back onto my circular needle. So I'm going to tilt them so the knit sides are facing me, and I'm slipping the stitches from the DP, the 6 stitches from the DP onto my circular needle. And again they are in one layer, all the knit sides facing out, and on the other needle here as well. And now they are ready for grafting. So for grafting, I'm going to slide the stitches from the DPN to the other tip of the needle, because I'm going to start grafting here where my 3 needle bind off has ended. And I'm going to place the working yarn onto a needle, and I'm going to connect these stitches with a Kitchener stitch with grafting them together. And for that I'm going to start with a setup. So I'm going to insert the needle, like this. So the first 2 ones are just for setup. Now I dropped the yarn, that's not good. So for the setup on the back stitch, and now I'm starting a repeat, and I'm going to insert the needle through the first stitch on the front needle as if to knit and take it off the needles, and then through the next stitch as if to purl and pull the yarn through. So what I usually like to do is I don't pull the yarn through super tightly. I quite like to leave a bit of a slack here and then go back later and correct the tension. So then for the back needle, I insert the needle as if to purl on the first stitch here and take it off the needle, and as if to knit on the next stitch and pull through. And that's what I'm going to repeat for all my remaining stitches. Knitwise take off, purlwise pull through, purlwise take off, knitwise pull through. So it's exactly exactly opposite from the front and the back needle. As if to purl, take off, as if to knit, pull through on the back needle, and as if to knit, take off on the front needle, as if to purl, pull through. And as you can see, I really try and not pull too tight when I pull the yarn through. Those stitches here are obviously looser than the tension of the rest of the hem, and I'm going to go back later and correct the tension. Couple more repeats. If you happen to run out of tail end yarn for your seam, you can go back and correct the tension earlier, and then you'll probably have enough again for the remainder. That usually happens with me. So let's see if I can pull it off. So for the last ones here, so if you only have 2 more on your needles, you pull off the first one here, and also the first one in back, and then you'll only have 1 stitch on each needle left, and that's where you want to insert on the front needle as if to knit and take it off, and insert through the back needle as if to purl and take it off as well, and then pull the needle through. So this has closed our side seam here on the hem, and here on the right side, this is the 3 needle bind off, and here is the Kitchener grafting. What I usually do now is I'll go back and make sure that those grafted stitches match the tension of the remainder of the hem. So I'm going to start here where the graft started, and I'm just matching the tension here of the stitches. I just find it a lot easier to like do this in like a separate step to match the tension than rather than trying to match it while I do the grafting. And if you have if you leave it loose enough, if you have enough slack, it's easy to see which one are the grafted stitches, and you can easily adjust that tension. And that's it. That's the almost invisible side seam here. You'll of course use that tail end then to when you weave that in, it will make sure that there is no hole left here later. But that is that side of the sweater finished, and we now have to finish obviously the sleeve here on top and the other side of the sweater. The right side of the sweater is going to start right here where we worked our provisional cast on. So I start by locating that extra long tail that I made when I made the provisional cast on, and I pull that first stitch through the tail end, and then I can just pull on the tail end. It unravels those crocheted stitches, and I'm a bit careful here because I'm going to place them on my needles one at a time. And what I want you to see right here at the beginning is I'm already under cast on stitches, and when I undo this one here, you can see that there is kind of a half stitch that was part of that cast on, so that was on this tail end of the yarn. And that is kind of something that shows that when working a provisional cast on and then working back in the other direction, your stitches will be offset by half a stitch, so they will not line up exactly with the stitches that I've worked in the other direction, but they'll be worked like half stitch in the other direction. So those V's that are worked in this direction are V's now in this direction, so they moved over half a stitch. That means that we now miss half a stitch right here at the beginning, and we'll also miss half a stitch here at the very end. So half a stitch here and half a stitch here means that we have, after picking up the stitches, one stitch less, one stitch fewer than we need, and I'm going to offset that by picking up an extra stitch here at the end of the cast on. But before that, I'm going to place all my stitches on my needles as they unravel. So I'm going to insert the needle and pull on my tail end of the yarn, and I'm like, you can do it you can unravel the whole thing and then place them on the needles, but I just prefer to go slow with that and be careful about it and just do it one by one. It's a little fiddly there because the hemline obviously has this turning point in there, so those are a bit fiddly to place on the needles, and the remainder are a lot easier because there's not so much tension on them. So I'm doing this one stitch at a time, but you can, like, if it's just along those, so that's what you want to avoid, but you can do like unravel along a line of stitches and then place them on your needles. So these are the stitches of both the front and back of the sweater, which means that after my setup I'll be able to continue with the side decreases or the shoulder decreases of the right side of the sweater. And I'm going to work this side in my contrasting color. But first we again need to do a little folding magic. So our double knit hem, the folded hem stitches are lining up nicely. Because they're now again in the single layer that we also had for the grafting. But for working them, we need them in a different configuration. So again, here is this half stitch offset. So this one strand of yarn was like part of our half stitch that was here at the end of the cast on. And this is where we need to kind of pick up an extra stitch. And I'm just going to use this little loop here that is between my stitches, and I'm going to twist it and put it on my needles. But you can do like any kind of pickup here on the inside edge here of the sweater to get like an extra stitch here to offset this half stitch offset of our provisional cast on. And this is where I again need to fold my hemline stitches to the back. So now I'm doing this folding here on the right side. So I'm going to place the first 6 stitches onto a DPN, and this time hold the DPN to the back of the book. That is because I'm now doing this on the right side, and I continue working with my contrasting color. So this is the pink one that you've seen from the provisional cast on, and I'm going to do the same thing that we had for the hem on the other side. I'm going to slip 1 stitches off the back needle, and I'm going to knit 1 stitch on the front needle. Slip purlwise with the yarn front and knit off the front needle. This is going to, like this tail end from this setup row of the other side, I'm going to just later weave in the end of that, and it's going to disappear. So slip 1 with the yarn in front, knit 1 until all my stitches of this DPN have been worked, and that should give me 12 stitches here on my right hand needle. So let's see. Yeah, that's the right amount. So I end with a knit 1 here, and then I can drop the DPN, and I'm again placing a marker to mark the point where the hem ends and the body of my sweater starts. And this is one where we also place a marker for the center of the row, and there's also already shoulder decreases, so follow the pattern for the right place for those shoulder decreases and how many stitches to work here before we get to those. Yep, that's 12 stitches. So those are the stitches that make up my hem, and I'm going to place a marker for that point. And then I'm going to rearrange those stitches here as well by first slipping all of those 12 stitches onto my right hand needle, and then slipping half of those stitches, slipping 6 of those back onto a DPN, and the next stitch onto my left hand circular needle, and then I'm going to tilt my DPN in this direction so that the knit sides of the of this hem face out on both sides, and the purl sides of this hem face each other, and then I slide the DP in so the tip is on this side, and then I continue with working the hem stitches just like we have done before. Slip one of the back needle, knit one of the front needle, slip one purlwise with the yarn in front, knit one. So our double knit hem is again in the right configuration for us to continue working the body of the sweater. After this first row with our contrasting color, we're now going to work just like on the other side of the sweater with those shoulder decreases or the side decreases here in the middle of the row towards the side, and then we're going to close it just like on this side here with a 3 needle bind off in the Kitchener grafting there. So I'm just going to work those rows now, and I'll see you when I have finished. And now I'm going to work again those extra rows on the sides. First here on the beginning of my row, which is now the back of my sweater, and then I'm placing the same number of stitches that I had here on hold for my sleeves, and then work those extra rows here at the end of my right side row, which is now the front of my sweater. So I'm going to work in pattern as established until I reach half of my sleeve stitches before the marker. So for the other side, I think I had 8 stitches on either side of my marker for the sleeve, and I'm going to place them on hold on a piece of waste yarn, and I'm also going to remove the marker in between. And after that, I'm going to slide the remaining stitches of the row onto the cable to be worked later, and then I turn around and work wrong side here on the stitches that are still on my needles for those extra side rows. So my last row for these extra side rows is a right side row, and I'm now at this underarm part right next to the sleeve stitches that are on hold, and I break the yarn here, and then I slide the stitches that are on my needles onto the cable on hold, and then I slide the other stitches that I were on hold that are off the sleeve stitches back onto my left hand needle, and I work the same number of rows now on this side of the sweater. This is now my front. So I start right here and I work another set of those extra side rows, and after this I break the yarn again, and then I slip the stitches that are on my right hand needle, I slip them back to my left hand needle. And then I bring the stitches that are on hold from the other side rows back to my right hand needle. And now it's time to close the side seam. So I'm bringing the 2 pieces together with the right sides facing each other and the wrong sides facing out. And I hold the needles parallel to each other in my left hand. And with a third needle, I'm going to work a 3 needle bind off for all the stitches that are before the stitch markers. So for this 3 needle bind off, I work with my DP in my right hand and my 2 needles of my circular needles in my left hand, and I knit 1 stitch of the front needle together with 1 stitch of the back needle, and I repeat this once more. And when I have 2 stitches on my right hand needle, I pass the first stitch over the second, and then again knit 2 stitches together, pass over. So that binds off the stitches and closes our side seam in one swoop. So I have reached my markers and there is only 1 stitch left here on my right hand needle, so I'm just going to remove the markers because they're just going to drop off anyway in a moment. And then I just move the stitches a little further onto the needle so you don't fall off, and I break the yarn, leaving a long enough tail for my Kitchener stitch. So I think it's better to have like a longer length than you'll need than too short of a length, so don't be too skimpy on that. So I guess like 1/2 meter or something, or even 60 centimeters, something like that. And I'm going to just thread the stitch through that last stitch on my needles to secure it. And then you can drop this 3rd needle of the 3 needle bind off and pull a little on the tail end to secure this last stitch. And now we have to again change the stitch order here of our double knit hem so that this double layer is in a single layer, and we can seam or graft those stitches together of the front and the back hem. And for that I'm again going to use my 3rd needle. I'm going to actually use like a smaller one, and I'm going to start with this needle that I still have in hand from before, and I'm going to just slide the stitches onto the cable on hold, and I'm going to start with these stitches that are kind of closer to me from the bind off. So when you have bound off, the ones that are closer to you are the ones that I recommend starting with. And I'm going to hold the tip of my circular needle in the back and my 3rd needle in front, and I'm going to slip 1 stitch from the left hand needle to the circular needle and 1 to the DP in. And I'm just going to repeat, switching between like the front and the back needles until all my stitches have been slipped. And then I tilt those 2 needles so the tips are facing each other, and then I slide all the stitches onto the DP in. They are now in a single layer. All the knit sides are facing out, all the purl sides are facing in, and I repeat the same procedure for the other hem side. So I slide them back to the needle tip so that the tip faces this 3 needle bind off, and then I'm going to hold again the circular needle and the DP in, both in my right hand, but this time I hold the DP in back and the circular needle in front, and I repeat the same thing. First the stitch slipped to the back needle and then 1 to the front needle, until all my stitches have been slipped. And I can drop my left hand needle, tilt those 2 needles that are in your right hand so that the tips are facing each other, and then slip all the stitches to the right hand needle, which is the which is the circular needle tip. So then have the single layer of stitches of one of the hems on one needle and the other hem stitches on my DPN. And now I'm ready and set up for grafting them together. So I turn the sweater right side out, so the knit side is facing out, and I hold the 2 needles in my left hand parallel to each other. I slide the stitches to the needle tips here. They're still facing the bind off side, and I use the tail end of my yarn from the bind off. That's somewhere here. The needle is still threaded in there, so make sure tail end points out. No, this is on the wrong side. See, that's what you need to make sure. So don't make sure that this is not twisted. So these stitches are now in like the wrong configuration if I hold them like that, because the purl side's facing me. So I need to turn the needle around and slide the stitches to the other needle tip, because otherwise the hem would be twisted and we don't want that. So that's good. So the knit sides are facing out, and here as well. So now it's time for grafting. For setting up this Kitchener stitch, I first insert the needle purlwise through the first stitch on my front needle. It's caught in all kinds of ends here. Let's see. So I inserted first purlwise through this first stitch on my front needle, and then knitwise through the first stitch on the back needle. That's the setup, and now we start the repeat of the Kitchener stitch, which is inserting knitwise through the first stitch on the front needle and take it off, and purlwise through the second stitch and pull through. Then purlwise through the first stitch on the back needle, take off, and knitwise through the second stitch and pull through. And this is what I'm going to repeat until I have only one stitch left on each needle. Purlwise take off, knitwise pull through, knitwise take off, purlwise pull through. There's a bit of a tail end here from those extra side rows, but I'm not going to worry about it. I'm going to just weave this in later. And I'm going to use like a duplicate stitch to weave in this end towards the wrong side of the sweater. So there's only 2 stitches left on each needle, and I can make one last full pass of my repeat. And when I have only 1 stitch on each needle, I insert through the stitch on my front needle as if to knit and take it off, and then as if to purl through the stitch on my back needle and pull through. And that is the Kitchener graft completed. What you can see again here is that those stitches are quite loose and a lot looser than the stitches are from the rest of the hem. And I'm going to just use my needle here to pull on this thread a little and try to just match the gauge and tension of the other hem stitches. I start where the Kitchener graft started, and I'm working towards the tail end that I have still on my needle here. So you want to make sure it's not too tight and not too loose, as close to the original tension as you can get. So it's just a little bit left here. Wonderful. That is the second side of my sweater closed. And at the moment the sweater looks like this. So it's kind of a sleeveless kind of vest. The next steps would be to work the sleeves, and for that you place sleeve stitches back onto your needles, and then you pick up some stitches here from this underarm. So between the live stitches on the needles, you pick up stitches here. The beginning and end of the round will be here, just where the side seam is. So you pick up stitches from this needle bind off here to the live stitches on your needles, then you work the stitches on your needle and you pick up the same number of stitches on the other side until you reach the center of this underarm again, and then you work the sleeves with some decreases here at the beginning and end of round until you have the right sleeve length, and then it's time to work the cuffs. And you repeat the same thing on the other side of your sweater. And then there is just the neckline left, so there's again stitches picked up from the edge stitch, and then some ribbing worked for the neckline. You can see here that the tension from the hem is quite different than the rest of the body, and that is because the hem stitches are only worked every other row, and these are worked obviously every row. But so what you see a little here is it draws in a bit, but it actually stretches enough to stretch with the whole sweater, and that is only possible because I do take care to knit those stitches loosely. And when you block it, you want to block it out just a bit, not stretch it out completely, but just give it a bit of a block so it's not drawn in too much. But it's such a neat and nice edge treatment here, this double knit hem.